In 2020, I made this video about the black metal band known as Mayhem, which I and many others dubbed as the darkest band in history. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching it before this one, but the very general and basic story behind Mayhem is that they were a band from Norway that were active in the 80s and early 90s and had an insanely controversial history due to many different reasons. They were responsible for a number of church burnings in the 80s, their guitarist Euronymous was killed by another band member known as Varg, and their lead singer, Dead, actually took his own life while he was living in a house with various other band members. That last one is what I'm generally going to be talking about today, because if you've seen the video or just know anything about the band, then you'll also know that Dead taking his own life was a huge turning point for the group, and this was mainly because of Euronymous' reaction to the news. He was living with Dead at the time and apparently even egged him on to do this, and when he actually did go through with it, Euronymous was the first one to find him, and his reaction was very, very strange. He went to a nearby shop and bought a disposable camera so that he could take a picture of his corpse, and apparently took some of his teeth and turned them into necklaces that the band would wear. He also turned Dead into a sort of martyr and used his image to further his own agenda, which made him one of the leading figures in black metal and turned an already narcissistic person into a full-blown egomaniac, which may have played into his death because Varg pretty much despised him at this point. The whole story is literally a Shakespearean play with Euronymous starring as Macbeth, and it's one of the most interesting stories in all of music. I've never covered something that had this many twists and turns, and it stayed with me to this day. But what I'm here to talk about is actually a detail that I apparently missed in my video, or at least people think I missed it, when in reality I kind of deliberately left it out. What I'm talking about is that infamous photo that Varg took was apparently used as an album cover for a Mayhem project. It went down in history as one of the most controversial album covers of all time, and was talked about everywhere around Norway, and then eventually became a bit of an internet phenomenon in its own right. But still, despite all of this, I didn't mention it in my video talking about Mayhem, which seems like a crazy thing to miss. I actually got thousands of comments about this as well. Unfortunately, YouTube have turned off the comments on my video, so I can't even screenshot them, but you'll have to believe me, it was a point of contention with my coverage on Mayhem. Safe to say, it was the #1 thing pointed out to me. So why didn't I mention the fact that Euronymous and Mayhem used this photo as the cover for one of their albums? Well, because that's not actually what happened. The idea that Mayhem did this themselves is a myth, or maybe a case of the Mandela effect, but it's not true. The album in question was never released by Mayhem themselves. It is from an album called The Dawn of the Black Hearts, which is a bootleg live album that was recorded in February of 1990, but it wasn't released until 1995, which was 2 years after Euronymous was killed by Varg. Mayhem weren't even active at this time, and they certainly had nothing to do with the release of this project. In fact, one of the only original members left at that time was a man I talked about in the video called Necrobutcher, and he actively disliked Euronymous because of how he reacted to Dead taking his own life. So much so that he left the band. So he almost definitely disliked the fact that this image was even used as an album cover in the first place.
Tragic thing happened to my band. One of my best friends also killed himself. And as I'm trying to cope with this, Euronymous tells me that he has taken photos of his dead body. I got very upset by this, and I told him, I'm going to beat you up, I'm going to kill you. Burn the photos before you even talk to me again. Because we had a different reaction on what happened. He almost felt like he was happy about it, while I was down with grief completely. Was crying and stuff, you know, for years. And he didn't give me any room to grieve. I was very mad at him. So when he was killed, he was my best friend for 10 years, but I never cried over his death. Actually, I thought maybe the cops would think that it was me who did it because I had plans to kill him myself.
That's why I didn't feel the need to talk about it in the Mayhem documentary, because it doesn't really have anything to do with the true history of the band. If Euronymous himself had done this, I would have 100% talked about it, but that's simply not what happened. But while we're on the subject, let's quickly talk about the bootleg album itself and where it actually came from. It was released by an independent record company called War Master Records, which was founded by a man named Bull Metal. Bull Metal was pen pals with Euronymous, and he was sent some of the pictures that Euronymous took of Dead. That's how he had access to them. That story isn't 100% substantiated, but what we do know is that the gig did take place in Sarpsborg, Norway, and was organized by a person named Metallion, a prolific member of the black metal community. Multiple members of other black metal bands were also in attendance, and it was by far the most famous lineup Mayhem ever had. The attendance at the time was around 300 people, and a YouTuber named Boris T made a video where he actually visited the venue in question, and it looks more like a house than anything else. At least that's what it looks like today.
Oh my god, yes, it's this one. There's a drum on the left, the stage, and there's a nice floor. Whoa, really nice place. Well, if there was 300 people, it was definitely full. One of the probably their best show with the best lineup they ever had. I'll be honest with you, I didn't think that I would have been so excited to be here, but when we came here, I just got so freaking excited.
It's an interesting video that shows the area they played in, and you can see why the gig has become quite noteworthy in the black metal space. It's not just because of the Dark album cover, but also because this was Mayhem at the peak of their powers, selling out a relatively big venue in a fairly small city, and I imagine it fully encapsulated what Mayhem were doing at the time. This is also one of the gigs where Dead did some pretty wild things on stage, a lot of which I can't even mention, but you can use your imagination. His influence had greatly impacted the band at this stage, and it was clear there was no going back. And that gig is the live recording that you hear on Dawn of the Black Hearts. A relatively short story, but interesting nonetheless. Still, I do scratch my head sometimes at just how many people truly believe this was a full official release when it was anything but. Even the lists online that I talked about earlier mentioned that this is a bootleg, but it's still such a common misconception that it's an actual Mayhem album. So much so that Mayhem themselves did officially re-release the live recording in 2019, however this time Necro Butcher was on the cover instead of Dead, which may further cement the fact that Necro Butcher did not like the cover of the bootleg album. Overall, I think it's simply an interesting footnote that got a little bit carried away. We know that Euronymous used Dead's passing to his advantage, so I suppose it's understandable that people would buy the idea that he would do this, but it's simply not the case. Maybe even he had some limits for how far he would go in that regard, but who knows. I never felt like mentioning it because it wasn't actually a part of Mayhem's history, and the amount of insane things that this band went through was more than enough. In comparison, this tidbit felt like more of an afterthought than anything else. That's all for this video. Like I said, just a short little thing explaining why I didn't talk about it in the original documentary. I will see you next week.